Welcome to Diplomats at Work, where we talk to active duty diplomats about their craft and life in the Foreign Service. AFSA, or the American Foreign Service Association, is the union and the professional association for America's diplomats. Our more than 16,000 members come from across 6 foreign affairs agencies of the U.S. government. And as the voice of the Foreign Service, which is our tagline, one of our key jobs is to share our diplomats' stories and educate the American public around the work that our diplomats do on America's behalf. So today, we're going to be talking to Lynette Behnke, who is a Foreign Service officer at the Department of State, currently working as the Unit Chief for Republic of Korea and Mongolia in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. If you've followed Diplomats at Work for some time, you know that we've really tried hard to highlight the varied jobs of the Foreign Service universe. So we've talked to folks from different foreign affairs agencies, from different tracks or cones, as we call them, and different specialist roles. Okay, 2 years into Diplomats at Work, we're talking to our first political officer. So we'll talk to Lynette about what a political officer does and her career. And we'll also talk to her about her last post in Kyiv, Ukraine, where she served as a deputy political counselor until February of 2022, when American citizens and staff were evacuated from Ukraine, and the embassy temporarily moved to Poland due to the Russian invasion. So with that preamble, thanks for your patience. Why don't we get started? Welcome, Lynette. And thank you for taking the time to talk to us. And I'm so sorry that it's taken us this long to get to talk to a political officer.
It's good. Thanks, Nadia, and thanks to you and to AFSA for having me today, and to everyone who's joined online.
Well, great. Well, let's get started. When thinking about sort of political officer, in shows and movies, they're often depicted as kind of the stand-in for the typical diplomat. I'm thinking of, Netflix show, The Diplomat, running to meetings with foreign government officials, going to fancy parties, getting all kinds of important information. Would you say that this is kind of a fair representation of a political officer?
Well, I have gone to some fancy parties, but I would say that I'm often working quite hard at them. One of the reasons we have diplomats and embassies in almost every country in the world is it's really important to have strong relationships with all those countries. And sometimes, sitting across from each other at a conference room table, exchanging talking points isn't the most effective way to build that relationship. You really want someone who, you want your contacts to pick up the phone when you call asking for help, and you want them to say yes. So we spend a lot of time on that relationship element, which is time consuming and does require some, I guess we'd call them receptions. But I think the thing that is a myth about diplomacy and about the work of the embassy is that it's only the political officers that do that. Because it's just as important that the public affairs officer is building those relationships with the press, with civil society, with youth groups, that your management section is building relationships with the customs officials and with the people at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who actually ensure that diplomats get the rights that they're required, that our belongings get into the country, and then our security people having relationships with security. So it's kind of across the board at the embassy that relationship building is really important, and not just something that political officers do. In terms of our actual role, I have a friend who describes it as sort of a cross between a journalist and a lobbyist. Because on the one hand, you're gathering information, you're writing articles or reports. It's not in a newspaper. It's just going internally to the U.S. government usually. And on the other hand, you're going in and advocating, lobbying for issues that the U.S. government, or actions the U.S. government wants another government to take. So it's kind of a combination of those things. I'll give you a couple of specific examples from my career. When I was in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, I was responsible for opposition political parties.
Mhm.
And so I spent a lot of my days walking, it was actually across the street, walking over to the parliament and finding people, meeting people, hearing what the different political parties were thinking, what they were planning, gathering that information, and then synthesizing it all for Washington so they would get a picture of what politics was looking like in Haiti. And then, my big boss, the ambassador, also would meet with leadership of parliament and political parties. And so I did a very core political officer function there where I wrote her talking points.
Mhm.
I wrote like a blurb on, the background of this person and why we're meeting them and why it's important that we have this discussion. And then I would go with her to the meetings, take notes, go back and write it all up and send it back to Washington. So that's, kind of the core reporting function of a political officer. And then on an example on the advocacy side, when I worked in Budapest, the government started to pursue draft legislation that was going to dramatically change the media landscape in Hungary. And when the US government decided to take a strong position on this against this legislation, because we felt that it was going to restrict media freedoms, as the human rights officer there, I went into the government and said, we don't like this. Here are the reasons that this is anti-democratic. Here's some evidence to back it up. And then I did that myself, but then I also facilitated much more senior people doing that, whether it was our ambassador or visitors from Washington who came to town and wanted to make sure that that we were supporting fundamental freedoms in Hungary. So those are just a couple of examples of kind of how it works in practice. And yes, there is a lot of running. Maybe it's a time management issue, but I've spent a lot of time running from meeting to meeting, especially, you mentioned the Diplomat, especially in London, in that building that they're always in. It's big. I wear more practical shoes.
So it's not as glamorous as they make it seem. So I can imagine that the effectiveness and the ease of political work depends a lot on the relationship with the country that you're in, or between the countries, or I guess specifically the governments. Is this a fair assessment? And also, you mentioned a little bit of what it might look like, but what's kind of the day-to-day of a political officer in any given embassy?
Yeah. I always find this question hard. I think it's really hard to say what the day-to-day is because they're all different. But the first part of your question really hits it on the head because it depends a lot on what our relationship is like in that country. If you're in a country where you have an adversarial relationship with the government or they restrict who we're allowed to meet with, your day is going to look a lot different than London, where we talk to them about anything and everything. And so it does really depend where you are and what the context is. But the basics, I guess I would say, I always start the day with reading. Because I'm reading the news, I'm reading any like internal reporting that's come in overnight, any requests from Washington for more information. And from there, I'm figuring out how am I going to spend my day. And it's often almost always not how you thought you were going to spend your day, because things come up and things change and we get surprised. And so, from there, you sort of figure out, what your priorities are. Some days you're sitting at your desk all day writing because you've had a whole bunch of meetings and you want to synthesize that into some sort of analysis about where human rights are heading in this country or something like that. Other days you're on a trip to a provincial capital to figure out what's going on outside the capital. So it can really vary. I think the one constant is that it's busy. We also do a lot of supporting US government visitors to the country. So like in Ukraine, before February 2022, intense congressional interest, obviously intense interest from Washington. So we spent a lot of time planning for and then welcoming members of Congress, senior members of the administration, taking them around town, escorting them to their meetings, taking notes in their meetings. I remember being in a meeting with Foreign Minister Kuleba and a whole bunch of senators, and he's sort of sharing what he thinks is going to happen, and they're sharing great words of support for Ukraine. So there's a lot of that. And then, we've alluded to that embassies have a lot of different employees. You've spoken to quite a few of them on this program. And it's the different state cones, but it's the Defense Department, the Commerce Department, USAID, and everything you're doing needs to be sort of coordinated and aligned with all of those people. So there's two really important things that I mentioned when talking about this. One is the integrated country strategy. So a document that's on state.gov, where everyone in the mission has gotten together and said, these are what our priorities are, and here's how we're going to make progress on them. And here's how they're, very importantly, here's how they're important for the American people, how they're going to increase, prosperity and security of the American people. And the second real core function is the country team. And other guests have probably talked about this, but the country team is a group of people headed by the chief of mission, and then including the head person from all these different state sections and different departments and agencies. And they get together at most embassies at least once a week. And they compare notes and talk about what's going on and see where we're missing connections between one department's work and another's, and things like that. So there is a lot of internal coordination in addition to all that external work that the political section does.
So as I mentioned at the top, you were the deputy political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv until you were evacuated in February of 2022. But when you arrived in summer of 2020, I assume it was a much different situation on the ground, both professionally and personally. What did it look like upon your arrival, kind of in terms of your work and in terms of life, so on?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly was a lot different than it is now. But it wasn't a normal time because it was the height of COVID. And so, I actually transferred that summer, when we knew very little about COVID still, and we weren't vaccinated, and, so there was a lot of uncertainty. So it was a little nerve-wracking. And in typical Foreign Service style, I'd been to Ukraine once before. So I knew a lot about the country, but I hadn't spent a ton of time there. But I showed up and it was summer. Summer in Kyiv is glorious. The weather is great. We did have a lot of COVID restrictions, which our diplomats around the world had to varying degrees. But we were still working really hard on core issues. We were working on some of the democratic reforms that Ukraine started and had been really dedicated to since the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. We were working with their security services to improve, civilian control of the military. We were working to, make sure they had the right IT equipment in their ministries. We were doing all kinds of things, and we had to do some of it remotely. But really, it felt like, while it was slow progress on some of these issues, everything was going in the right direction. In terms of Ukraine's democratic trajectory, its movement towards EU and NATO membership, et cetera. Like I said, life was good. I think I would say the time that I reflect on being the most normal is probably like the next summer of 2021, because we had gotten vaccines for everyone at the embassy. And a lot of people in the country had been able to access vaccines through many of them through U.S. government programs. We had passed sort of a very tense time in March, April, where Russia actually built up troops at the border. And we didn't know what that meant. And we had a very tense time. And we actually got the Secretary of State to come out and offer very strong words of support for Ukraine's sovereignty and its territorial integrity. And then it was summertime, and beautiful city, glorious churches, river views, a lot of arts, restaurants, ballet, things like that. I took a great trip that summer with my family. I have a husband and 2 kids, and we went west to the Carpathian Mountains and went hiking for a week. And it was just sort of like Ukraine at its best. And then in August, we celebrated the 30th anniversary of Ukraine's independence. And Ukraine went all out. They had a huge parade. It ended with a flyover from the Maria, which was the biggest airplane in the world, Ukrainian airplane, that, sort of famously in late February of the following year was partially destroyed by the invading Russian troops. Just a lot of like pride in what Ukraine had accomplished in 30 years, and hope, because at the same time they had a big conference called the Crimea Platform, that was kind of all about how, first of all, that Crimea is Ukraine, and how, and reminding the world that Crimea is Ukraine, it was not Russia, and that what was happening there was not right, and the world needed to maintain focus on it, that and of course what was happening in the occupied areas in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass. And so that was, to me, that was sort of like, if I think about the typical time in Kyiv, and when we were working at our fullest in the embassy without the COVID restrictions, and when like we were really living life, it was that summer of 2021.
So you describe this time of optimism and I don't know, things are trending in the right direction. And just a few months later, we have the invasion, the Russian invasion. So walk us through what work looked like in those months leading up to the invasion. Was there a sense that something like this could happen? And how did you prepare?
Yeah. It's I've been thinking about this, in preparation for this, and trying to actually put myself in that time rather than thinking about how I feel about it now. But we were busy, I guess. We had, as I mentioned, we'd had the sort of incident in the spring with the Russian buildup of troops. So a few of the processes, the types of meetings that you have if you're looking at a potential crisis, we'd been through a little bit of that. But this one felt different. And so we really just like, and for my team, being the political section, being responsible for, we had a political military section responsible for working with on security issues. We had a section that looked very closely at the situation in the Donbass and for what lack of a better word, negotiations over the future of that part of Ukraine. So we were really involved in these issues. And so as we started to get inklings that something bigger might be coming, we had to really go into overdrive to try to figure out what was going on, what the Ukrainians were thinking about it, what our partners and allies were thinking about it. So, we met at all levels, a lot with the government, with folks from other embassies, with civil society, sort of across the gamut, just sort of the work I described before, but really focused on this particular issue and this particular threat from Russia. I remember very distinctly going to a meeting with the defense minister, with the chief of mission, and having a really hard and kind of scary conversation about what might come to pass. And of course we didn't know, but the US government took a decision to declassify a lot of the intelligence it was seeing, and to put that out there in the public domain, and to make very clear that Russia was not being provoked, that Russia was making plans that were not that were in contravention of all kinds of international norms. And so because we had all of that in the public domain, we were able to talk about it with lots of people and get lots of opinions on what was going to happen. And then we had a lot of coordination with Washington, with the State Department, with the Defense Department, talking about what we were hearing. Our job was kind of to provide the perspective from Kyiv. So here's what we're hearing in Kyiv. Here's what they're thinking. Here's what they're preparing. Here's the intelligence they're seeing versus the intelligence we're seeing. So, I mean, that was really the focus. I mean, at the same time, we were sort of trying to, continue doing the normal work that we've been doing, because by no means was it a guarantee that Putin was really going to do this. But certainly it was a huge focus. And all those things, writing the cables, reporting back to Washington, preparing the ambassador for meetings, all those things were just happening in sort of hyperdrive, I guess. Um, and the other thing that struck me and has struck me looking back too is there was a real dissonance between the conversations we were having internally with the government, et cetera, and then like walking around this city that was living its life to the fullest, right? And part of that is because they were already occupied, right? Like there was a war, there had been a war for 8 years. So people were sort of used to that. They were used to the level of fear and uncertainty that came with some of these stark warnings, in a way that I certainly wasn't, right? That was not my life experience. And so it was interesting. Like I think the first time I heard like a normal, like an average person on the street talking in any way seriously about a Russian invasion was the weekend before I left the country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So when did you know that the embassy was evacuating?
Well, it went in stages. And I mean, the good thing, I guess, if there is one, is that unlike a lot of the evacuations that the State Department does, think about Israel right now or Sudan, we had a lot of time to prepare because we had all this forewarning, we had all this intelligence, we had, so we had time to think about it and think about what we would do. And so like our security officer, our management section, our IT people, like everyone had to think about what if we have to leave? How will we leave? What will that mean for these different activities? So,
Thinking,
so
like how
sorry.
far in advance did that thinking start?
I mean, months.
Months.
I mean, keep in mind the context is that in August of 21, we evacuated Kabul, right? Um, and I wasn't there, I wasn't involved in it, but certainly by many accounts, after the fact, there hadn't been enough planning. So we started really early. I mean, I think Bill Burns went to Moscow in the very beginning of November,
Mhm.
to try to talk to Putin about this. So I mean, if that
Yeah.
was happening, we were already planning for different eventualities at that point. Um, at Christmas, I went west with my family for a holiday. We went to a nice lodge, and I took our birth certificates, and like our important documents because it wasn't obvious to me that we would be going back to Kyiv.
Yeah.
Maybe we were just going to keep driving. So we didn't know for a long time, like when we would leave, if we would leave. I mean, in the end, so families left in January. I sent my family home. A lot of people, like me, sent our families home, and then the embassy employees stayed in Kyiv. Some embassy employees left and began supporting the effort from Washington. Um, and but when I sent them out in January, I had no idea actually when I would see them again. Like there were a lot of we thought they call it ordered departure or authorized departure. They make the decision in 30-day increments. So like we knew they'd be gone for 30 days, but maybe they'd come back 30 days later because the crisis would have passed, or maybe they'd come back 60 days later. And we actually, because we had time, we were able to send a big box of stuff home. And I sent with them like my kids' bikes and like, I don't know, things I thought they might want to play with for the next month or two. And then a few weeks later, I sent a second box and it was photo albums and like everything I didn't want to lose because the situation really did, I think, intensify very quickly, between when the families left and when the rest of us left on February 13. Which was I have to say like a really hard decision for embassy leadership, that it was time to go. But And it was complicated, not just for the folks at the embassy, but there were all these other Americans in Ukraine, right? Some of them were regular expats, but we had, I mentioned, I think I mentioned, there's there was a monitoring mission done by the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, out in the Donbass. So there were Americans like in the Russian occupied areas that were we had to figure out, like, should we tell them to leave? There were National Guardsmen who were in Ukraine training the Ukrainians. The Pentagon decided to relocate them out of the country. But there were all these hard decisions. And of course, anytime the embassy announces that anytime the embassy makes a decision about its own staffing, it has to announce that to everyone, to all the Americans. So we were very public about it. And the State Department spokesperson actually said it is past time for American citizens to leave Ukraine. So we were pretty obvious about the fact that we thought now, this was mid-February, now's really the time to get out of here. And the other thing that happened is when we did that, of course, a lot of the airlines would no longer, they certainly didn't want their planes in Ukraine overnight. They were worried about what would happen. So they all changed their flight schedules. So it became harder, even before the missiles started flying, it became harder to get out of Ukraine, actually, which is why we sort of, we had been encouraging Americans for a while to make plans.
So from the moment that it was decided that the embassy was evacuating and relocating to Poland to the moment that you were on the plane flying out, how long was that?
24 hours. And I mean, so it was, that sounds really stark. There were a couple of different groups of people. So I was in a group that was going back to Washington. I think I knew I was going back to Washington a few days before that. But the group that went from Kyiv to Lviv in Western Ukraine, they didn't know they were leaving Kyiv, I don't think, until pretty late. And then of course they actually couldn't stay in Lviv for very long, because they actually left, literally the missiles started flying, and that's when they left for Poland. So we'd had a presence in Ukraine up until pretty close to the beginning, I guess, so to speak.
So we've discussed, on this program before, that the locally employed staff that make up a really big percentage of U.S. embassies, of the workers of the U.S. embassies. Did the Ukrainian staff continue working once the Americans evacuated?
They did. And I can speak most personally about my team. So the political section, and our team was incredible. So we were the Americans were sort of spread out: Washington, Lviv, from Poland. The Ukrainians eventually were a bit spread out as well, some in Kyiv, some in other quieter parts of Ukraine, although eventually there were no quiet parts of Ukraine. And some chose to leave the country temporarily. But everyone kept working. We had, I guess the silver lining of having gone through the pandemic was we knew how to do our jobs remotely, and we knew how to keep in touch. So we had Teams meetings every day. We, the Ukrainian staff were just this invaluable resource, some of whom were on the ground, or at least they were talking to people, because they had tons of contacts across the country. And so they were really the ones, feeding in a lot of the information about what was really happening. And I remember one member of the team, he could, his windows were shaking because he could hear the shooting and the tanks coming into Kyiv. So we were getting that kind of information. And they stuck with it. They showed up every day. And I think, recognized that, one of the things they could do for their country was to keep the United States informed and in the game. There was one particular story that also kind of stands out to me. You asked about, when we left, what happened. Right after the Americans left, there was there were actually some Afghans who the Ukrainians helped evacuate a lot of Afghans from Kabul. And so there were some Afghans who were in Kyiv waiting to be processed to maybe come to America or go somewhere else. And we, felt like they were kind of our responsibility because they were waiting on us. And some of our local staff, including one from my team, like physically helped them get their passports, get to the airport, and get out of the country right, after the Americans had left, and we sort of said, we need this help. And they raised their hands, these two women, and said, absolutely, absolutely, I will do that. I will help these people. And I thought that was just like in a time when there was so much fear and uncertainty for themselves, that they did that was just incredible.
You mentioned that you were in Kyiv with your family and with your two kids. How did they fare in the displacement evacuation process? I mean, dropped in the middle of the school year, I guess, back to the States and all the uncertainty of what was going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, they were incredible. My husband was amazingly strong throughout. I mean, he has a career. He was working remotely in Ukraine. He had to stop doing that for quite a while to get us relocated, to get the kids relocated. They actually ended up leaving because of these flight things I was talking about. They ended up leaving like 2 days earlier than we thought. And so it was a real rush to get them out the door, but we did manage to take some time to go sledding like the night before they left. And right behind our building, there was this big sledding hill with the other, kids from our building. They went out there and kind of enjoyed their last evening. My kids were pretty young. We didn't really know what was going on, but we did have to explain to my 4-year-old at the time, that she was leaving, mom wasn't coming. And what we said was, mom's not coming because she has to help keep the bad guys out of Kyiv. And so she made me a sword out of cardboard. She cut out a sword and colored it and left it with me and said, this is to help you keep the bad guys out of Kyiv, which was kind of amazing. And then we didn't know how long it would be, but it actually wasn't that long. Like I said, we didn't know how this would play out, but I flew home a couple of weeks later. And when every time I come into that international arrivals area at Dulles, I remember them, running at me and so happy to have me home. And I think it's one of the things that is really incredible and maybe not that well known about the Foreign Service is the family element and the sacrifices that all of our families make. Whether you're in a difficult place or a nice place or whatever, you're still moving a lot. It's disruptive. Your kids have to make new friends. Your partner has to find a new job. And so, families just make these incredible sacrifices. And it became really obvious in that moment with my family and with many other families. But it's true kind of around the world.
Well, even more stark, you go into an environment where you do think you're going to have a relatively peaceful post. The families are able to come join you. And then I think it's a reminder that things can really change on a dime. We call our diplomats, we say it's the first line of defense, and it really is in many ways, right? You're on the front lines and seeing it all change, and frequently at personal risk to yourself. So obviously you're no longer posted in Ukraine, but I wonder if there's anything that you can share about what's happening right now in the embassy in terms of staffing and operations. I mean, it's still very much a conflict situation. How is the embassy managing, I guess?
Yeah, and I don't have firsthand knowledge, but I did when I came back, I kept working on Ukraine for the next 5 months or so. But the embassy resumed operations May 18 of 2022. So 3 months after we left, we were back in Kyiv, and there's some amazing photos of the team, small team, but the team raising the American flag over the embassy, and it's been up ever since. So we are there. We have a growing number of people there. It's grown, over the last year and a bit. But it's very different. I mean, they're restricted on where they can go. They spend a lot of time in the bomb shelter. There are sirens a lot of nights. And they're still trying to do all those jobs that we were trying to do before, the political jobs, but all the other jobs too. So it's hard, but we have a really strong team out there, and a really the Ukrainian staff we were talking about, the political team, they're all there, and they're making it work, and it's incredibly impressive.
Okay, well, those are the questions that I had prepared for you. And I know we've gotten several questions from our audience. So bear with me as I switch over to see what kind of questions we have. So let's shift a little bit and maybe start with an easy one. How did you join the Foreign Service? And, how did you decide to pick the political cone?
Yeah.
Or political
I'd love to tell you I thought really deeply about this. No, so I, as everyone, I decided that to take the Foreign Service exam. So I graduated from college. I had studied abroad. I traveled a bit. I really wanted to work overseas, and I was, I'd majored in international relations. I was just interested in these issues, and I wasn't necessarily looking to join the Foreign Service, but that was one of the options that looked good. I thought, I'll take this test. I won't pass it. It's notoriously very hard. And I went through the whole process, and sort of still surprising to myself, I got in, although I like to think I'm pretty good at it. So yeah, I joined, pretty early in my career. They have these like 3-sentence descriptions on the website of what the different cones are, and I thought that was the one that fit me best. But I think actually seeing what the embassy does, I do like it. I like being a political officer. I've done an economic tour as well. I like some of the other functions too. And I think I would have been happy a lot of places, but yeah, it wasn't the most thought out thing. I recommend other people talk to people who are in the Foreign Service about what the different cones are
before deciding.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. What kind of skills, this is still relating to the craft, I guess, and joining the Foreign Service. What kind of skills do you think are important to cultivate to be a successful political officer, as opposed to the other cones?
Yeah. So, the big one we talk about is interpersonal skills. I don't think that's distinct for the political section. But because no matter what you're doing, you're probably doing some manner of negotiating. You're doing, being able to get along with your colleagues, to have hard conversations where people don't necessarily agree, whether that's with your colleagues, whether that's with a foreign government, like all those sort of those people skills are really important, not necessarily only to a political officer. For us, writing is extremely important, and being able to write quickly. I'm always struck. I was when I came in, and I am every time we get new people, or we get interns who are in university. Like, the writing is totally different, right? It's short, it's pithy, it's to the point, and it just, people need to be able to read it really quickly and understand exactly what you're saying. So that's a particular skill that people learn in the State Department, but that is really important for political officers. I think we all are asked to be generalists, so understanding of global affairs, of the world, like a broad knowledge is important, but you don't need to come in being an expert on South Korea in order to succeed. But you need to have these sort of basic skills that will help you become an expert on South Korea in about 1 month, when you're then called on to speak for the US government on Korea policy, for example.
Okay, next one. Thank you for your time today in service to our country. Do you have any tips for aspiring political officers moving forward in an ever-growing multipolar world? Go for it.
Do you? Um,
After you.
no, I mean it's hard, but I think I mean we were talking about this in my team a little bit recently. The particularly like now when you see, Hamas's attack on Israel and you see the discussion around that and you see the reaction from China and from Russia and those things can just feel like hugely overwhelming and insurmountable. Um, and as a political officer, as a foreign service officer, you feel, I don't work on these issues directly, but you like it's going to drag you in. We're going to ask the Koreans to do something about it, right? And you feel some sort of natural responsibility for all of these things, and you feel very overwhelming. And so it's, I think, remembering that you're part of a team of people who are all working towards the same goals, who bring different strengths and perspectives, and figuring out how you bring all those strengths and perspectives to bear to collectively be adding more to the effort. And I guess as I move into more like managerial roles, that's something that's a real important challenge, because it's not about the individual economic or political officer and what they know and what they're reporting. It's about that. How do you knit all that together to make the sum larger than the individual parts? And then I mean it's hard. I think the information space right now makes it really hard because there is so much misinformation in the world. It's incredible how much information there is. And that can be really useful, but it's also hard to distinguish. So these are some of the challenges that newer folks coming in are going to have to address and deal with. But I think we've been doing it for a long time. We get really good people at the State Department, and we'll be able to change, adapt and keep doing good work.
Having talked to a lot of foreign service officers, obviously through this program and others, one thing that strikes me is for a good foreign service officer, adaptability, flexibility, and curiosity really seem to be the sort of the key qualities, I think, of a good officer. All the things that you said, but being able to change, as in your case, and adapt to a very different environment, I think is really probably key to longevity too in the foreign service.
Yeah, and because it never goes according to plan. Nothing that
best laid plans, right?
Nothing that I've done has gone exactly according to the plan. So, but it's been
tips. You mentioned, we there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Are there tips, having done this work now for a long time, or to kind of sorting through all of that and knowing who you can trust in terms of the information provided, or what platforms, or whatever sources of it?
We have at Sea, we have something called the Global Engagement Center that works a lot on this and does offer like tips, and they'll do analysis of certain events and where, which information about that event was true, which wasn't, et cetera. So we do have some tools. I think, the private sector has necessarily had to come up with some really good tools and ways to filter information. But everyone's figuring it out. I think, when that's one of the real added benefits of embassies and of political officers is that you're there, right? So you can just go talk to the foreign ministry and ask them what they said, right? You don't have to just look at Twitter and say, like, this statement said this, right? And so we're constantly ground truthing those things, which is time consuming, and, pushing back on something false is really hard. We did a lot of it in Ukraine. We did a lot of it before the invasion, and we continue to do it. And so, and then, individuals being smart consumers, of course, is really key.
Yeah.
And we actually do a lot of, training people on that and whatnot.
Yeah. We should do even more. Okay, the next question. How challenging was it to keep Washington on top of all the Ukrainian political players by the eve of the war, especially with rhetoric about it? Imagine that things were moving quite fast.
Yes. No, that's really true, and a good point. I mean, things were, at the very, the last week before the invasion, I was in Washington, and like the deluge of information that we had every day was just incredible. And so, and what the embassy was doing, what my section was doing, was, trying to consolidate things, keep it as short as possible, keep it to the things that we thought really, really mattered, and send that in and make sure, that if you read one email today, it's this update on what's going on. But yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the challenges we have is keeping the right people informed, and people, our seniors weren't just worried about this, right? They had lots of other things on their plate. There are other crises in the world. So you just had to be really judicious about what you were, what was important, what you were reporting, what really needed to move right then, and what could wait a little bit. But yeah, I mean, the amount of information was just incredible. And I'm sure, there were lots of things in the press and like things that ended up being, propaganda from one side or the other. I mean, but we were really focused on, not just what's happening, but what do we need to be doing, right? And what we need to be doing is rallying the international community, is, making these statements at the UN to demonstrate how strong and resolute our support is, getting those weapons into Ukraine, getting that humanitarian aid into Ukraine. So, focusing too on the concrete steps we needed to be taking helped a lot, but it was hard with so much information and so much noise.
Yeah, I can imagine. What lessons from this evacuation do you feel that you learned, the good, bad, ugly, that maybe shaped you as a manager, as a leader, and so on?
The top thing that comes to mind, there's a lot, but the top thing that comes to mind, I think, is communicating through uncertainty. Because like I said, it was several months of uncertainty. We didn't know what was going to happen. We know now, but to keep talking about it, as a manager, to keep talking to my team about what I knew, me and the political counselor is an extraordinary officer, what we knew, what we didn't know, what could happen, without going down too many rabbit holes, but like just giving people like some sense that they knew as much as they were able to know about what was happening in their world. So I think that was really important, and just that continuing to have the conversation, not assuming that like because you were in that meeting everyone knows what's going on, because maybe that didn't get communicated widely, things like that. And then I think the other thing is just, and this has nothing to do with like me, but just witnessing how incredible people are, how people respond to a crisis, to a challenge. Fortunately, I think the world knows how the Ukrainians respond and responded to this incredible challenge. But I'm proud too of my team, the Ukrainians and the Americans, and how we pulled together, how we figured out what was important, and how we kept moving forward when we were exhausted, we were emotionally distressed, we were worried about our families, we were worried about all these things, but we kept, we all believed really strongly in what we were doing for America, what we were doing for Ukraine, and moving forward. And it helped that you felt that too, in the United States, with all the Ukrainian flags everywhere, and that this was top of mind for really the whole world.
So, as you're speaking, you mentioned evacuation from Kabul, which was very different, and obviously what's happening right now in Israel and Gaza. And I'm struck by the parallels, but also by the differences. Is there a way that we can be better prepared for that next one? Are there lessons that we can learn? I mean, in addition to the communication, which is probably key, but is there a way to be better prepared for that next crisis, an evacuation? Or
yeah, I mean, I think There absolutely is. You know, and we've done, you know, with Kabul, there was, you know, a long, you know, sort of report and investigation into it. There's similar things. State always does sort of a hot wash on these sorts of things. But I think they are all a little different. They do have a lot of things in common. Some of the logistics of like who needs to make a decision on this. How is that decision made? When is that decision made? And I learned a lot about that through this process that I had no idea about before. And that, you know, I think the department is constantly updating its guidance for these kinds of events. And we do have a, you know, a team in Washington that helps people through this. Like they immediately reached out in, you know, in November of 21 to say like, you know, we've done this before. We just did it with Kabul. Like, let us talk to you about how this works. So we do that kind of learning from the past. But like you said, like it could happen anywhere. It could happen at any time. So it's also about like training our people to be prepared for these kinds of things, regardless of whether it actually looks like, you know, tomorrow you're going to have this issue. You know, and like, you know, the military prepares for all kinds of things that never happen. Right. Yeah. And I think, you know, we need to do more of that ourselves at state.
Okay, I have a few more questions that sort of run the gamut. So I'll just go for it. Did your A100 level training, and maybe explain what A100 is, prepare you for the evacuation, or do you feel you can offer important lessons learned to improve this training? So piggybacking on our previous question for other state employees. This sounds like a planted question somewhere.
Is this from my A100 coordinator, who I can see is in the chat? So A100 is what I think they actually have recently given up this term, but it was what used to be the entry level course that we did for diplomats. So I did mine in 2006. It was 7 weeks, I think, and it's where you get like the real basics of how the State Department works. You get your first assignment. So for me, I got assigned to Port-au-Prince. And yeah, we absolutely talked about these kinds of issues, but it didn't feel real. I think when I got to Port-au-Prince, it started to feel, Sean says that the question was not from him. It did start to feel more real. And that's where like training sort of in the middle of your tour really comes in handy. We did have some times, I mean, when I was in Haiti, I'd been there year and a half. We considered evacuating, actually. There were riots. It was actually a time there were riots around the world about global food prices. And they were particularly bad in Port-au-Prince, and we actually considered evacuating. So I got some real on the ground experience early on about what that process looks like. So yeah, but we need to do, and I think we have added gradually more and more training in a dangerous world on how to deal with these sorts of crises and how to prepare. But everyone needs to be prepared, right? Like, so it's not just the management team who has to actually, you know, process the things. It's not just the political officers. It's like, you know, it needs to be everyone who's has at least some understanding and awareness of the process.
Give us some advice about being an FSO with a family. How does that work? We mentioned that there are sacrifices that partners take, that things can happen at the last moment. How do you make it work?
Yeah, I mean, communication.
Yeah.
I think
be a running theme.
You know, you do, you know, as with any sort of negotiation, you want to make sure they're actually bought in on the decision, right? I've had this conversation with tons of friends where it's like, you know, the employee wants to, you know, for career purposes, I've had this conversation, but for career purposes, the best place for me to go right now would be, you know, Bucharest. But for the family, the best place to go is this other place. And that's where the, like, you know, things not going according to plan and being willing to be flexible comes in handy. And it's a conversation with your family about what what you value about this career, about your lives, and how you're going to fit those things together. And there are options. There are lots of jobs in Washington. So some people spend a good chunk of time in Washington for the purposes of kids' education or something like that. But everyone has to make that decision on their own. But I will say, like, it's doable, and it's increasingly doable, I think, due to remote work, because you're able to have two working parents who aren't necessarily both State Department officers, or they can. I have personally been able to work that out in a way that I think 10 years ago we wouldn't have been able to.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thanks everyone for their questions. Thank you, Lynette, again, for this really great conversation. I want to make sure that you get to let us know any last sort of words or anything that maybe you'd like to mention that we didn't cover through our questions today.
Thanks. I mean, not much. I think, it's fun to talk about being a foreign service officer. It's really important to keep talking about Ukraine. So, talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, like, keep this in people's minds, that, this war is happening. Ukraine can win. They have to win, but they need our support. So I think that's really important. And there's a lot of resources out there for, on state websites, on other websites about how you can help, where you can donate, things like that. But, it's been, I think, an incredible showing of the support and will of the American people over the last year and a half. And we have to keep that up. And thank you for the opportunity.
No, thank you. And thanks to everyone again, and Lynette, and see you guys next time. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.